Enquanto você ouve suas músicas e podcasts favoritos, deixa eu te perguntar, você já sabe da novidade do ano? Chegou a nova Fiat Titano. A nova picape da Fiat faz bonito nos terrenos mais desafiadores. Performance com motor turbo diesel 4x4 e câmera 360 graus off-road, que ajudam você a ultrapassar qualquer obstáculo. Sem falar que ela tem a maior caçamba da categoria. Tá esperando o que para conhecer? Nova Fiat Titano, chegou a sua vez de fazer história. Paz no trânsito começa por você.
Welcome to the Politics Guys interview, conversations about American politics, economics, history, and culture with authors and researchers from across the ideological spectrum. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. You might be wondering why we have an interview today instead of our usual Wednesday, responses to listener questions and comments. Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, we had a little bit of a communications snafu, and Jay wasn't able to do the show this week. And many of the listener questions we had involved Jay, so without him, there really wouldn't have been a whole lot for Trey and me to discuss. Secondly, we're actually going back to Wednesday interviews on the Politics Guys. Not every Wednesday, but on a fairly regular basis. Now, as you probably know if you've been listening for a while, a little over a month ago, I started a second podcast, Politics Plus. And in that, I planned to have a new interview every week. Well, it turns out that was overly ambitious, let's say. It's not that I couldn't get enough great guests to come on. In fact, I've got this major backlog of really amazing guests, and I've developed relationships with a bunch of publishers that are sending me books all the time and asking me to have their authors on. It's really been overwhelming. The problem is that it takes a lot of time to read these books and put together what I consider to be, what I hope to be, thoughtful questions. And I really didn't want to be the sort of interviewer who just kind of, throws some questions together after reading whatever the flap of the book or the intro and the conclusion, just basically to create regular content. I mean, I feel like there are already too many interview shows like that, and what's the point of having another one? And then after that, I ended up with this great opportunity to publish my own book. It's going to be all about kind of the largely hidden ways in which government action or inaction makes our lives worse, and in some instances, what we can do about it. I'm really excited about this project, but it's going to take a lot of time and effort to develop. So once I realized all this, my initial plan was to feature a new interview on Politics Plus every 2 weeks. But I've abandoned that idea for a couple of reasons. First, I realized that having sort of a newish podcast, which Politics Plus is, that only releases a new episode every 2 weeks, that's more or less a recipe for podcast failure. People expect something new every week, and I get that, so do I. Second, and more important, I think, there were a number of Politics Guys listeners who told me that they would prefer interviews to be a separate podcast, and that's what I was kind of basing this on. But it turns out there are a lot more of you who don't want to subscribe to another podcast and would rather have everything, including interviews, all in one place. That became very clear to me over time. So in the weeks to come, I plan to post my Politics Plus interviews on the Politics Guys, most likely on Mondays, and this will be in addition to our regular Saturday and Wednesday shows. But there won't be anything new on Politics Plus from this point on. My guest today is Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, or Dr. Mona as she's called, director of the pediatrics residency at the Hurley Medical Center in Flint, Michigan. She's also an assistant professor at Michigan State University's College of Human Medicine, where she heads the Hurley Children's Hospital Public Health Initiative. It was through her courageous and unflagging efforts that the public learned about the dangerous levels of lead in Flint's drinking water. Her work has been recognized by numerous environmental groups, including the Michigan Environmental Council, the Children's Environmental Health Network, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. She's the author of a recently released book on the Flint crisis titled What the Eyes Don't See, a story of crisis, resistance, and hope in an American city. Dr. Mona, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Michael.
I'd like to start by letting listeners know that, What the Eyes Don't See, it's obviously a book about the Flint water crisis, but It's a lot more than that. So even for people who think they know the story of the crisis, and I bet there are parts you don't know, you'll still get a lot out of it. I mean, it goes into Dr. Mona's family history, which is fascinating, the history of Flint, the science of lead, the history and the practice of epidemiology. I mean, there's a ton of stuff here. And so I wanted to start by asking you, how did you decide on this approach for the book?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And probably one of the most common questions after people pick up this book is like, I thought this was just going to be about Flint. And
Right.
It is definitely not just about Flint. It's my memoir. It's about me and who I am and where I came from. And, I really tried to separate it all out. And maybe, and my initial thought was I would just write about Flint. But it was impossible because to know me and to know my actions and to know where I came from definitely played a role in the crisis and the uncovering this crisis. I also wanted to include a lot of history in the book. So there's, like you said, epidemiology history and public health history and lead history, the history of Flint, because without that knowledge of that history, we so often repeat our same mistakes. And without that knowledge of history, we fail to understand how we got into our current situations. So that was really important to also include in this book.
Yeah, and it really gives the book a kind of a depth and a richness that that people who just followed the story from newspaper accounts just obviously wouldn't get. And I wanted to ask you about Flint because it's a city that I think most people would say for a while now has been in decline. And so why did you decide that you would practice medicine in Flint?
Yeah, so Flint's really been in crisis for decades. Disinvestment, unemployment, poverty, racism, you name it, almost every disparity we have in Flint. And I wanted to practice pediatrics there because I wanted to be in a place where I could serve, where my skills were needed. I didn't want to go to some suburban community where the children were by and large okay. I wanted to be in a place that I could make a difference, and that is absolutely what drew me to Flint.
And well, I think that's great. I wish more folks felt that way. Before we talk specifically about the crisis, I'd like to talk just a little bit about lead, the health effects of lead. So could you explain a little bit what the effects of lead exposure are and how significant it is as a toxin?
Sure. So lead is probably one of the most well-studied neurotoxins. We've known about its impact on health and development really for centuries. Most recently, in the last few decades, incredible science has taught us that there actually is no safe level of lead in a child. Even the lowest levels, and now we know really the very low levels and the first increments of exposure impact a child's neurodevelopment. So what does that mean? So it actually impacts cognition at a population level. It drops children's IQ levels. It also impacts behavior. So children exposed to lead have higher rates of attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity, problems with other developmental issues. It's even now known to have an epigenetic impact where your environment impacts your DNA. So it has these life course altering impacts, primarily for the youngest children. And we worry about the youngest children because that's when their brains are developing, especially at that really critical 0 to 5 window.
Right. And if I follow correctly from what you mentioned in the book, lead poisoning, you don't see the effects necessarily right away. And I guess that would make it difficult in times to kind of pinpoint where it's coming from. Is that right?
You got it. Absolutely. And that kind of gets to the title of my book, What the Eyes Don't See.
Right.
So very literally in our crisis, you don't see lead in water, but you also don't see the consequences of lead. In pediatrics and in public health, it's known as a silent pediatric epidemic. Children don't present with symptoms, acute intoxication of lead exposure. It's not something that we see really years later. And when we do pick up on something, We can't often go back and say it was because of being exposed to lead several years ago. So it's innocuous. Even the very astute, physicians are unable to diagnose it, and that's why we have screening programs set up in place to screen children for lead exposure. But really, that's not the best way to do it either, because that just tells you there's an environmental problem. We need more innovative strategies to screen environments like paint and soil and dust and homes and water before children are exposed.
Yeah. And well, you just mentioned lead in paint. And of course, for a long time, we've known that lead in paint, paint chips and that sort of thing, and dust is dangerous. But until not that long ago, weren't there actually some supposed authorities who said, well, low levels of lead in the water supply, that's not really that big of a deal?
Yeah. So a lot of the emphasis in medicine and public health has been on lead paint and lead soil, which was contaminated from lead and gasoline. And that's kind of, what my training has been focused on is, those are the most common sources of lead. And I think it was almost a blindness of the profession not to realize that we have other sources of lead, something else our eyes don't see. And to be honest, before this crisis, I did not even know that there was lead in plumbing. And I am a pediatrician with an environmental health background, a public health degree. I'm a mom with small children, and I did not know that there was lead in plumbing. And I couldn't believe that, because the word lead actually means plumbing. So it comes from the Latin plumbum. The elemental symbol for lead is Pb. So lead actually means plumbing. And all this time, and all of my career, as a pediatrician, taking care of children, with lead poisoning, my mind never knew, and thus my eyes never saw the possibility that there could be lead in water.
And it's not just necessarily that we haven't seen this, but also, and this is when you get into the history of lead in the book, that, some big companies, and you specifically mentioned General Motors, what they did in terms of actually actively promoting lead-containing products.
Absolutely.
You suggest in a way that's similar to what tobacco companies did, right?
Absolutely. So the lead industry was absolutely evil. And they forced the use of lead in paint, in gasoline, in plumbing, even when they knew there was harm. I take a really deep dive into the role of General Motors, specifically an engineer, a renowned engineer, Charles Kettering, who put lead in gasoline, tetraethyl lead, and poisoned more children around this world than any other source of lead. And at that time, there was debate, and there was folks saying, hey, this is going to be harmful. This is harmful. This is hurting people. And there were alternatives to using tetraethyl lead, but General Motors had a patent on it, and they made a lot of money. So this is similar to many stories throughout industry where industry has had the upper hand. They've swayed policymakers, and their actions have harmed children.
Yeah, it was just a shocking story to me. I had no idea about any of that. Moving into specifically the Flint crisis. Now, if I recall correctly, the whole thing started when Flint had been getting its water pre-treated from Detroit. They decided to build their own pipeline to Lake Huron, which would, in the long run, save money, but until they could do that, they were going to get their water from the Flint River, which they did starting in early 2014. And in the book, you call this the crucial mistake. Can you talk about why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you got it. So, Flint was under emergency management, where the goal was to save money. And the decision to change the Flint River was a cost-cutting move because the water that we had been getting from the Great Lakes via Detroit was deemed too expensive. So in April of 2014, we switched to the Flint River as a temporary move until a new pipeline that was being built to the Great Lakes was to be completed. So that was the critical error, switching to the Flint River. And it wasn't the fault of the Flint River. Many people think that the Flint River, was the source of this problem because it was it had a legacy of industrial pollution, but it played a part because river water is innately more corrosive than lake water. But the critical mistake was switching to that river water, but not treating it properly. So the necessary ingredients to treat the water, something called corrosion control, was not added to the Flint River treatment.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of things that just kind of honestly baffle me about this story, but that's one thing that I just totally can't wrap my head around because, the Safe Water Drinking Act is pretty clear that Flint's system was required to have this corrosion control. I didn't even know that water was corrosive to pipes, so I learned something there. But, since a lot of those service lines in Flint are lead, that clearly obviously would mean that lead could leach out into the water, which it did. And in the book, you mentioned that corrosion control was never used and nobody knows why. How is that even possible?
To this day, it's mind-boggling. And then as I was writing this book, I was, reliving all of these moments and going through this. And I continue to have my mouth ajar. Anybody in the water world who knows anything about water, they're like, first of all, nobody goes from a really high-quality water source, the Great Lakes, to a low-quality water source, unless maybe you're running out of water. But, the Great Lakes aren't running out of water. So that was like a critical thing. Like, why would you go from something that's such a good water source to something that is not as high quality? But on top of that, why wouldn't you treat it properly? And, we talk about how all this was an austerity move, but, the cost of the treatment, so this corrosion control, it only would have cost $80 to $100 a day to treat the water properly. That's all it would have cost. But that wasn't done. And then the actual pump to install this treatment was never installed. So there was no intent to treat this water properly. And there's multiple investigations. So maybe one day we'll find out the why wasn't this water ever treated properly? And, I think, but I'm not sure this is my opinion, that, that because this was just a temporary move, I think folks were just hoping to kind of skate by. Let's just see, the least amount we can do for this short period of time, and then we'll be back on a better water supply.
Yeah.
But I have no idea.
But even from an economic standpoint, at that cost, and given all the costs that have been incurred, even if you don't care about the human cost, that's just a horribly bad economic decision too.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then, even when the EPA found out it wasn't being treated properly, and they told the state, you have to treat this properly, even then they dug their heels. They're like, oh no, we don't have to do this. It is mind-boggling because the delivery of safe drinking water is fundamentally a public health issue.
Yeah, well, and also, you talked about lead being silent and so forth, but right after the switchover, people were complaining about the quality of the water, not just a few isolated things. And from there, you'd say, well, okay, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality is going to come in, they're going to test, they're going to find the problem, and then they'll fix it. And they did, in fact, test, but they claimed that the water was fine. And how can you talk a little bit about how they missed this?
Yeah, once again, it's mind-boggling. So, right when we switched to the Flint River, there were complaints almost immediately. The people of Flint were heroic, and they would go to town hall meetings with jugs of brown water, and they would voice concerns about odor and the taste and the smell and all these complaints. We had bacteria in the water, and we had boil advisories, and then they dumped a lot of chlorine in the water, and just the added chlorine, people felt like they were drinking a swimming pool, and that irritated people's skin and eyes. And then because we had so much chlorine, we had elevated levels of a chlorine byproduct, something called total trihalomethanes. It's difficult to say, but it's a long-term carcinogen. It causes cancer. So, there was not, a week that went by that there weren't concerns raised about this water. And so much so that just within a few months of switching to this water source, General Motors, which was born in Flint and still has plants in Flint, stopped using this water because it was corroding their engine parts. There were so many missed opportunities. There were so many red flags in the story that should have ended this crisis and brought in relief. It never, ever should have gotten to the point where I had to come in with evidence of children's blood levels. It should have stopped like a year and a half prior.
Yeah, and there were these incredible stories. One you talk about where when they would come in to test the state, and they would say, "Well, we'll flush the water. We'll let the tap run for 5 or 6 minutes." And I thought, well, who does that when they're giving water to their kids or themselves? And how incredibly absurd is that?
Yeah, but that is a common technique done everywhere, not just in Flint, but often water utilities, when they are sampling for their, lead and copper rule requirements to see how a system is doing, they will do those loophole techniques. They'll flush the water prior to collecting the water. They will take out the aerator and then collect the water. They'll use a different kind of jar to minimize the amount of lead captured. Those are things that are done throughout to minimize how much lead in water is captured, so that action remediation doesn't have to take place.
And I guess they can do that because in the standards it doesn't say that you can't do it, and so that's, like you said, a loophole basically.
Exactly. So the lead and copper rule, I have learned, the national lead and copper rule is weak. The rules on the book did not protect Flint, and we, to this day, have lots of loopholes in that rule. And most importantly, that rule has not caught up with the science of lead exposure. The action levels in that rule are not health-based. They're based on the feasibility of a water utility. We need to move in the direction of protecting children. Something that I have learned, which I had no idea of before, that we were never anywhere in the U.S. intended to have lead-free water. It protects you a little bit, but you never were intended to get lead-free water. But with updating these regulations, listening to the science, we have the opportunity to learn from Flint and strengthen these things.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in all of this?
Yeah, so my involvement came really late in the story. And, I often think about the Flint water crisis, or the uncovering of the water crisis, as a series of dominoes. And really, I'm one of the last dominoes. The most important folks in the story are the people of Flint who, like I said, were sounding alarm bells, trying to get folks to pay attention. That got journalists involved, investigative journalists. That brought in an amazing EPA scientist who defiantly, wrote a memo proving that Flint had elevated water lead levels. He was unfortunately silenced. And then through the work of really citizens, it brought in a water expert named Mark Edwards, who is a kind of internationally known lead and water expert. He uncovered the DC lead and water crisis about a decade ago. He came in when he heard that the people of Flint weren't being listened to. When he heard about lead and water, he literally packed his minivan overnight with graduate students and supplies and drove up to Flint from Virginia to use citizen science to prove there was lead in water. And he was sharing his results, and he was also being dismissed. And then I very randomly, from a high school girlfriend, Elin Batanzo, who happens to be a drinking water expert, who happened to work for the EPA, who knew Miguel at the EPA, this amazing EPA whistleblower, who had heard about Mark Edwards. She happened to be at my home for a barbecue in the late summer of 2015. And she's the one that taught me so much about water treatment and the fact that Flint wasn't treating their water properly. And because of that, there would probably be lead in the water. And that is the very first time I heard about the possibility of lead. I was, to that point, telling my patients to drink this water because I was being told that it was safe.
Yeah. And that had to just feel awful when you realized. And now it seems to me that this is people might think this is a little more straightforward than it is in terms of proving what's going on. Because if I figured it out correctly, you need to determine, number one, whether there was an elevated level of lead in the water, which was pretty easy to do, maybe. But also, and here's where I think it gets tricky, to discover whether or not there's an elevated level of lead in children due to that higher water lead level. And then finally, that all of this was causing health problems. That sounds to me to be pretty difficult to do.
Yeah, and this was kind of the missing link in Washington, D.C. a decade ago when they had a lead and water crisis. That proof of impact took years and years and years later after the crisis. So learning those lessons, we realized that we needed to have timely proof of impact. And maybe if we had that proof of impact, then maybe somebody would listen and we'd be able to get rid of or change this water source. But going back to the principles of public health, we never should have gotten to that point. Just the detection of lead in water, which Mark Edwards proved, just the knowledge that this water was corroding engine parts, that should have been enough. So in public health, there's a concept called primary prevention, which means you are never supposed to expose a population to lead because you can't do anything about it once they are exposed. So you are supposed to do everything to detect it in the environment before the child. But we had passed that point. We had already found it in the environment, in the water, and nothing was happening. So I felt that I really needed to have that data in my pocket. I needed to know if it was getting into the bodies of our children, and then hopefully action would have been taken. And there's so many limitations, not only in lead and water detection, but also in blood detection. Our research, which did show an increase in the percentage of elevated lead levels, was a gross underestimation of exposure because children were at that time not being routinely screened for lead in their blood. But most importantly, and this is kind of the nuances of the science and where people often make assumptions based on these numbers, lead in water impacts a different age group of children than the usual surveillance lead data. So we, as pediatricians, we screen children for lead at the ages of 1 and 2. At those ages, children are crawling and they're walking and they have a lot of hand-to-mouth activity, and that's when they're at risk for household lead exposure. So like lead paint and lead dust, and they're always putting it in their mouth, especially lead paint because it's actually sweet. And so we screen children at those ages, high-risk children, like kids on Medicaid, because that's when they're at risk for those sources of lead exposure. But lead in water, it impacts a different age group. It impacts the unborn and crosses in utero, and it especially impacts babies who are on formula. Most of our children in Flint are on formula. We have terribly low breastfeeding rates, and they are mixing this lead-tainted water with their powdered formula. So it's a younger, more developmentally vulnerable age group that's impacted. And that is not picked up on blood screening data because lead in blood has a very short detection window. It has something called a half-life of 28 days. So all of the blood lead data that our research was based on, even though we showed this elevation that then the CDC validated and subsequent research has also validated, was a gross underestimation of this population-wide exposure.
And it's those numbers that you came up with, those were not, I mean, those were pretty startling numbers in the first place. And to say that they're an underestimation, that's pretty stunning.
Yeah. So, what we saw was an increase in the percentage of elevated lead levels in Flint, and nothing happening outside of Flint that wasn't getting Flint water. And we also noticed that there was an even greater increases in areas where the water lead levels were the highest. So it definitely correlated with the geography. And this was contrary to everything that was happening in our nation, in our state, in our city, where over the last few decades, really, the percentage of children with elevated lead levels had been coming down and down and down, even in the city of Flint. So even if we had showed a leveling or a plateau, that would have been a red flag. But once again, having the blood work was that ultimate game changer in the story, but it never ever should have gotten to the point of blood data. It just stopped really when we had the water data.
But then, so you discover this, and naturally, if I were in your position, I think, well, okay, I'll take this to the authorities, the public health folks, and they're going to freak out because this is an obvious crisis, and then they'll take the appropriate steps to, protect the public. But that wasn't the response you got, was it?
No. So, I was pushing every button trying to get folks to pay attention, and that I wish that was the response. And I naively thought that would be the response, that, when I shared this information, when I shared these concerns, people would take action. And they would also follow another kind of philosophy of public health, which is called the precautionary principle. Let us take precaution until we know more. Let's err on the side of caution. But, the city, the county, the state, were very much believing what the water folks, that everything was okay and everything was in compliance.
Yeah, it just felt like a real CYA type of thing where we're making sure that you didn't have to take responsibility from these agencies was far more important than actually, protecting the health of the public, which is,
Yeah, which is why so many of the criminal charges are also related to the cover-up.
Yeah. So at that point, obviously, and this wasn't like a quick and easy decision for you, pretty clearly, as you mentioned in the book, you ended up deciding to go to the media. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened and what sort of pushback you got once you did that?
Yeah, so this is definitely something that doctors and academics do not do. This was kind of a form of academic disobedience.
Yeah.
So you publish research in journals, and it goes through the peer review process. But that takes a long time. That takes months and months. And this research could not wait another day. So really, with a growing team at my side, which included our health coalition, our medical society, other physicians, we shared this data and this research at a press conference and called for a health advisory. We called for people to take precautions, especially the youngest children, and we called to go back to treated Great Lakes water. And, I felt great after that press conference. I'm like, yay, finally people are aware. They knew that there was something wrong with this water, but we provided details about specifically the lead in the water, and hopefully we'll be able to protect folks. And right away, my research, my data, and my credibility was attacked. And I should not have been surprised, because everybody in this story until me had been attacked. The moms and the pastors and the journalists and the water scientists, everybody had been dismissed and attacked. But I was surprised, and really nothing I could have been prepared for, to have also my science, hard facts, also being dismissed and denied.
Well, it's got to be, I imagine it's got to be one thing to sort of intellectually know that this might be coming, but when it's actually happening, that just has to have an emotional impact that's difficult to work through. I mean, it sure seemed that way in the book.
Absolutely. And like I said, writing this book brought back all those emotions. And it was visceral. It was physical. And, there was a knot in my stomach that literally wouldn't go away. I stopped eating. My heart rate went up. When the entire state tells you you're wrong, it's hard not to believe them. So for a moment, I thought I screwed up. I thought I was wrong. But ultimately, the kids woke me up. My research was based on numbers, but those numbers were children. And those children put me back in the fight.
Now, at some point, Governor Snyder ended up putting together this panel to study the issue. You call it in the book the Five Guys Group. So can you talk a little bit about what that report found?
Yeah, so the governor appointed a task force to look into what happened in the Flint water crisis. And it was 5 men, so I was a little shocked that they couldn't find one woman on this panel. But they did a phenomenal job. They really they interviewed a lot of folks and dug deep and really put the blame at the feet of the Department of Environmental Quality in Michigan, specifically the Office of Drinking Water. These were the folks that were charged with treating the water properly, that didn't treat the water properly. So laid the majority of the blame there. But they did not, they also pointed fingers at every level of government, from the city level to the state level to the federal level, the EPA as well, that more could have been done. This report also very clearly articulated that this was an environmental justice issue, an environmental injustice had occurred. They mentioned that because of the lack of democracy, because Flint was under emergency management, and because of the demographics of the population, that this crisis not only began, but continued for as long as it did.
And when you talk about the demographics of the population, I mean, there's a racial component to this, essentially, is what the report found. So if this were if this were some sort of wealthy Detroit suburb or something like that, it's likely this wouldn't have gotten to this point.
Exactly. It never would have started, let alone continued for 18 months. There's folks, Jesse Jackson called it a crime scene, and Michael Moore, who's from Flint, said it never would have happened in a wider, richer community. And this is what not only this Five Guys report articulated, but the Michigan Civil Rights Commission also wrote a report which said essentially the same thing.
Yeah. Now, in the end, Flint ended up switching back the water to Detroit. And if I have the dates right, it's been around 2.5 years since that happened. And so I'm wondering, now do you recommend to your the parents that it's okay for them to drink the water in Flint? Is it safe, do you think?
So we switched back to Great Lakes water just a few weeks after my press conference. What we were told was impossible became possible.
Yeah.
But for the 18 months that we were on the corrosive water, it ate up the infrastructure, and that infrastructure is being replaced right now. So we are about a third of the way through replacing our lead service lines. We've replaced about 6,000 lines. There's about 9,000 left. And once we do that, we'll only be the third city in the country that's replaced their lead pipes, which is pretty amazing. However, when you do infrastructure work or groundwork, earth-moving work, that disrupts the lead scale that's underneath, and that can increase the release of lead. So it's because of that, the folks in Flint who haven't had their lead pipes replaced need to continue using filtered and bottled water. But the water is definitely improving. The quality has significantly improved, and it's great that we're replacing the infrastructure. In regards to safe, I don't think I will ever say water is safe anymore in Flint or anywhere else. What I have learned, like I said before, is that the rules on the book do not guarantee lead-free water. And until those regulations are strengthened, I recommend to my patients in Flint and anywhere else that if you especially have a vulnerable population like a pregnant mom or young children, to have a lead clearing filter if you want to guarantee no lead in that water.
Yeah. Well, one of the first things I did after I finished reading your book, I ordered a lead test kit from my home, and my municipal water supplier offers that for free. And so I figured, well, I really want to know. And so I'm wondering, do you think I was overreacting? I mean, I'm an adult, obviously, but I was a little freaked out, I got to say, and I wanted to know,
Yeah, did you get the results back?
I haven't yet, no, but I am very interested in finding out. And I was very careful to not run the water or anything like that beforehand, just a clean sample and so forth. So I'm eagerly awaiting the results.
That's awesome. And that has been one of the awesome ripple effects of our water crisis, is that people around the nation are paying attention to their water. They're paying attention to lead. Almost week after week, we hear about another school who's testing, found lead, and now is putting plans in to fix. Testing lead in water is tricky. It's almost as tricky as the detection of lead in blood. You can test a home 5 different times and get 5 different results. Wow. 0, 0, 0, 0, 1,000 parts per billion, 0. Sometimes it depends if a piece of lead scale just happens to come off. So we were seeing a lot of those particulates in Flint. It depends on the time of day of testing. It also depends on the season. When it's warm outside, you have more lead that will leach into the water, which is why you're also never supposed to use warm or hot water from your tap for cooking or drinking, because that increases lead in your water. It depends on the collection, how you're collecting it, how fast you're running the water. So there's a lot of nuances and details in terms of water sampling. But it's awesome that people are thinking about it and testing, and hopefully testing properly, and then taking actions to protect their families.
So it sounds like...
But there's other things that really simple things that people can do to protect their families. So I mentioned never using hot water. Like, honestly, I didn't even know that before this crisis. Like when my kids were little and I made macaroni and cheese, I used hot water from the tap because it boils faster.
Well, sure, yeah.
So you're never supposed to do that. So like I said, hot water concentrates the lead in the water. So you're always supposed to use cold water for cooking and for drinking. Everybody should be flushing their water. So run your cold water from your tap after periods of non-use, like maybe 6 hours overnight, and run it until it gets super cold. And then that's how you know you have water from the main line. That gets rid of all the sediment that's inside your plumbing. So just those kind of two simple things will help protect children.
It's great information. And like you said, a lot of stuff that I had no idea of as well. But it sounds to me like in the end, the only truly safe thing is going to be when all of these service lines and all of this other lead-based plumbing is replaced with something that's safer. Right. Just lead's inherently unsafe.
Exactly. So like I said, there is no safe level. So and this is a national problem. So lead wasn't restricted until our service lines until 1986, but lead was not restricted in our brass fixtures until 2014. So Flint schools had some of the highest lead and water levels, but big buildings don't have big lead pipes. It was leaching out of all their fixtures from the corrosive water. Unless your home is built after 2014, you probably also have brass, fixtures that may have some lead components in them. So there needs to be massive education, but also massive investment in infrastructure to get the lead out of our plumbing.
Yeah, that's not going to be cheap, but it seems like it's definitely something that we need to do. I mean, given the effects,
Right.
I noticed not too long ago, doctors at the Hurley Medical Center where you work, they had some sort of vote to use the term lead exposed instead of lead poisoned when they were referring to Flint. And I was wondering what you thought about that decision.
Yeah, it's a game of words. It's as if changing the words would have changed what happened. And this is also reaffirmed why my book is so important. Doctors are often very myopic. If we don't see a child in front of us seizing and acutely intoxicated, it's hard for us to understand that there could be long-term consequences of subclinical exposures. And that's really what my book is all about, is educating folks that, even if our eyes don't see like an acute intoxication, does not mean, that children weren't exposed and may have maybe even worse impacts. So this also kind of reminds me or fits into what's happening with our nation of these ongoing efforts at science denial. Flint is very much a story of where, common sense science was denied, the science of water and corrosion. But we see that nationally. We see that with climate change and vaccines and the regulations at the EPA that are being threatened to protect our health and safety and our air and our water quality. And this is another effort to kind of deny the science of lead toxicity, of environmental health, of public health.
Yeah, and it always seems to happen when somebody has an economic interest. I don't think that's coincidental.
Yeah. Yep.
I guess one final question for you. I'm sure I know you've learned so much from this, but what do you feel like is the most important thing or a couple of things that you've learned from this entire just awful but incredibly educational, I'm sure, experience?
Yeah, what I have learned from this story, which is an ongoing story, it is definitely not history. I have learned of the power of activism, the power of resistance, and the power of hope. So I hope people come away from this book is that, it is a story of a terrible, tragedy, and there's lessons to be learned. But it's also the story of folks coming together, of folks opening their eyes, of folks who said, we've had enough and we want to make a difference in our community. And Flint is a place where people have rolled up their sleeves and are absolutely doing incredible things for the children. And this is not just a story of Flint. These are things that can be done anywhere by anybody, by a mom, a school teacher, a nurse, a journalist, a pediatrician. We all have the power within us to make a difference in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. In the end, that was a sort of a tragic story, but an inspiring story in that regard. And it's a great lesson to take away from it. So, with that, we will close. Dr. Mona, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Support from listeners just like you is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll see there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever other podcast app you use. Share this episode with your friends and followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguyspage. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.